to allow for long-established coaching behavior. If you call a coach on yelling or mistreating an athlete, in some sports they say that's sport, shut up and go away. And that's being written into, that culture is being written into, not initiated by Paul Melia, let me be absolutely clear about that, but the rewriters of the UCC, and this is where we are today, are insisting on that. As you've heard, the athletes have been ignored. I should also say the researchers have been ignored, in addition to the work of Peter and Gretchen Kerr, Sandy Kirby, many others across Canada have contributed both national and international research to this issue. And it's as if they never did that work or published any of it. And there's been no effort, as my colleagues have said, to change the culture through education. We still are hopeful because there are huge opportunities here. There is tremendous, wide and deep public support for the completely independent universal mechanism to address not only gender-based violence but maltreatment that my colleagues have argued for. There's been a federal provincial task force, CCES and AthletesCAN, the National Summit, have all called for such a mechanism. Wherever the government has sought advice, this is what they've recommended. The public and media commentary has been supportive as well. As Paul Melia indicated, we've been down this road before, and we've established pan-Canadian independent bodies to do the important things that the sports can't or won't do, particularly with respect to doping, addressing doping and dispute resolution. Yet the federal minister, despite her passion for addressing safe sport, has been persuaded to just breathe new air into the old failed system. So why is this very fine minister going so slow? I should say I have a lot of time for her. We were good colleagues at the University of Toronto. Her heart is clearly in the right place, yet something has her terrified. She is receiving powerful, persistent pushbacks from the national sports organizations and the mostly male coaches in the system. Her government has become very cautious as it approaches this election, fearful of the jurisdictional complexity, although we can tell you all kinds of examples of federal, provincial, territorial programs that have worked in our area. They are afraid of controversy, and I think they've got tired of an activist agenda. In one meeting I had with her, it became very heated, and she kept on pushing back, and finally her aide said to me, "Bruce, you don't have to be elected." A very good minister is very timid. And as my colleagues have indicated, we live in a funding culture where the pursuit of the podium surpasses all other goals, despite the rhetoric about an athlete-centered system. So this is a dilemma for all of us in the area of safe sport, but everywhere else. We have a government which has set out a very fine ambition to shape sport across Canada in terms of doping-free sport, the accessibility of all persons, fairness and respect, and so on. And yet, the real money rarely goes into anything other than high-performance sport, and they're rarely interested in sustainable spending to affect change. Though heavily subsidized, the NSOs cry the autonomy of sport. I was delighted when Nikki said this morning that we should abolish the autonomy of sport. And few NSOs have the ability or the capacity to contribute to major change here. They too are addicted to the glitter of the podium. This conference is very timely for us in Canada, and I hope we can breathe the energy of this conference into our ongoing struggles. Because the two themes of this conference, athlete power and real scrutiny of governments, are part of the strategy for change. Athletes must gain more control over their sports. Ashley didn't tell you about the about the AthletesCAN representation project, to do that in Canada. Other athletes have talked about similar projects. Becky Scott talked about equal representation for athletes. I'm convinced that until those changes are effected, change overall will continue to be slow. And we need to do a much better job of holding government's feet to the fire, to walk the talk, realize their promises. To this end, those of us who are activists and athletes need to, and this is my list for effective change. First of all, bring sport into public discourse so that whenever there are national elections, as there are in Canada, ending next Monday, that sport is part of public debate. It can't just be a hidden off area that's left to Sport Canada and the NSOs. We need to forge better links with other social actors, as we've done from time to time during these efforts, but not recently in Canada. Recruit them to this campaign. Given Me Too and everything else, this would be really easy to do. And of course, reciprocally support them in their campaigns for more genuine democratic societies. Canadians need to leverage the very encouraging international developments that we're hearing about here, and particularly the international mechanisms that are available, so that we can use the international example and the international and the national obligation that Canadian governments have under international agreements to effect change here. And finally, we need to continue to problematize high-performance culture. One of the great opportunities of safe sport is that it will bring about a more human, athlete-centered culture for sport, something I believe we're all committed to. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me thank all the panelists particularly for this, and particularly Ashley and Erin. I've read the prevalence reports, I've read the master's thesis that is associated with it, and to hear it being presented by athletes was I felt particularly powerful today. So before I open it up for questions, I just want to give you one anecdote about how ill-informed the minister has been by her staff and by sport organizations. The major trigger for the minister's interest in this was a particularly heinous case of sexual abuse, a criminal case that was in Canada involving a downhill ski coach and a lot of athletes, some who became pregnant as a result of the sexual abuse that was imposed on them. And the minister's press conference response to it was to reiterate two items from the 22-year-old policy that had never been enforced. So, she thought she was presenting some new stuff, that, we'll take funding away from any organization that kind of thing. Never been done before, and nobody had told her that that was already the policy that was supposed to be in place. So let me open it up for questions, and Jay, I think you need a microphone.
So we talk about an athlete-centered sport, I'm wondering if, for the athletes who have grown up in the sport as it exists and has existed for a while, where in many cases emotional and sometimes even physical abuse has been normalized, pain and suffering certainly have been normalized, will they, as they become, as their voices get heard, are they contradicting the voices of the other athletes? And I guess I direct this to the two athletes. When you're working with your peers, are there other athletes who endorse, for example, the exceptions that Paul and Bruce have talked about?
Yeah, I think that's definitely an interesting question. It's something that we've thought a lot about. There's no denying that all of this has become very normalized within the sport community. You're taught to toughen up, you're taught that this is part of sport, you're taught that this is what you need to do to be better, and this is the only way to get better. I guess what we're seeing more is there are more athletes that are coming up and saying the negative consequences of that, and they're seeing the impacts of being emotionally harmed, and they're speaking up about it a little bit more. And so that tolerance of this is just sport, the narrative is slightly changing. It still has a long way to go. I think another part of it is coaches and their coaches before that all believe that the best way to elicit performance is through these methods. And I think that's something else that we really need to tackle is, are there better ways to coach? When we look at education, for example, we are shifting towards an empowerment structure where you're taught to empower students, you're taught to empower them, and to be able to bring out their best abilities. Yet, when we look at sport, it's still the belief that the best way to do that is to yell and scream and do all of these things, which are obviously not the case in so many other sectors. So I guess it's still questioning that narrative of why do we believe that this is the best way to success, and is it the best way?
Ashley, did you want to? No? Okay. Question at the very back.
Spencer Harris.
Oh, thank you, Spencer. I'm Stanis from Play the Game. My question goes to the whole panel, but maybe mostly for Ashley. So yesterday we heard the representative from Team Denmark talking about the issues with the Danish swimmers who came forward with also psychological harms. My main concerns in sports at the moment is that we tend to see the problems 10 years after they happened. So my question goes that what do we do in the organizations and federations to be a little bit before a whole decade has passed?
Well, we know the answer to that, and that's to have an independent body for athletes to be able to report to. And what some sport organizations don't seem to understand is that initiatives that are currently running or being piloted in the system are not independent. They might have the independent label on them, but there's perceived conflict of interest, perceived bias by the athletes, and so they don't feel safe still to report, even though there's a third-party, independent, safe sport officer within your sport. That person who's independent is still paid for by your NSO, and in a lot of cases may have taken on a case or two representing the NSO in past issues against an athlete. So there's a huge lack of trust, and that really, I mean, in the study we found that athletes who are retired were typically more likely to report the types of harms that they were experiencing, or just reflecting back on their experiences. So that's because they're out of the system. They're not afraid of retribution, and I think those are the stories that need to be told in the education process to active athletes. But without that independent body, without that safe place to report, nothing is going to change in the system. Whether you have a universal code of conduct that everybody agrees on, if that doesn't change, nothing will.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Spencer Harris from the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, and I was kind of struck by the apparent power that NSOs have in Canada to actually define what abuse is. And are you able to, in a system that's so resource dependent on government investment, why have they got such a powerful voice in defining abuse?
If we can answer that question. Paul, do you want to talk about that?
Well, yeah, I'll try to respond to it, but we don't know the complete answer for sure. But one of the things we've heard over the course of this conference is that sport does see itself as operating outside of the normal rules and laws that govern society. And so in that sense, they kind of operate that way, in that autonomous way of operating. And so they're not at all shy to bring forward in a very forceful way their opposition to removing their control over monitoring and administering safe sport in their sport. And then you have a minister who wants to do something, is passionate about doing something, but perhaps surrounds herself with the wrong advisors. And she trusts those advisors, and they guide her, and she has unfolded this opportunity in this fragmented, disconnected way that has not addressed the most fundamental issue, which is the creation of an independent organization to administer the program. And her bureaucrats will support her as well, saying, oh, jurisdictional issues with the provinces, never get it done, who's going to pay for it? This will just be such an expensive operation. So rather than get together and say, what is, based on best practice and evidence, the most effective program we could build in this country? And then let's look at the cost issues of the jurisdiction and work through them, because they can all be worked through. Instead, they've been and these are major sport organizations. The smaller ones are very supportive of the model. But hockey, swimming, skating, they're all in opposition to losing control of this.
I just want to add to that. We talked a little bit about the Universal Code of Conduct and exclusions, and how it wasn't initially written in, but then it was written in, and a lot of that was based on the feedback from sport organizations. So when athletes had their consultation around this Universal Code of Conduct and exclusions came up, obviously we felt very strongly that there should be zero exclusions outside the rules of sport. And what constantly is coming up at the table when we get into this exclusions piece is, well, my sport is a contact sport, so there has to be exclusions. We're not talking about, wrestling or taekwondo or, boxing where you're hitting somebody. That's not what we're talking about. And I think we all understand that concept. So the excuses around that need to stop, and it really falls back to the culture of high-performance sport. So we, as the athlete body, made very clear that we will not support the Universal Code of Conduct if there remain exclusions. So we're not going to back down from that.
And if I could add to that, as we were conducting the consultation, and over the summer we got those strong recommendations for those exclusions, right? That the culture of sport is different than the rest of society, and we need to build in these opportunities for effective coaching techniques to be maintained so that we can be successful in sport. As we've now taken it out to the independent experts outside of sport, child abuse experts, experts in sexual abuse, and a full range of them. We have over 18 experts now who have taken time in a short period of time to give us their advice. They have said, when they've seen the exclusion clause, they say, if that's in there, your code is useless. Absolutely useless. So,
and I would add that there's been a long history which encourages both parties to continue as the same. Sport Canada requires, through the sport funding recognition policy, a whole series of social requirements around language policy, around gender equity, and so on. And rarely have they been monitored, let alone enforced. So the NSOs know that they can probably just stonewall and not do it. On the Sport Canada side, they also know that history, and are reluctant to try to really enforce something. The only times, and this would be a good discussion, the only times where there have been breakthroughs is when strong ministers have said to their staff and to the sports community, this is what we're going to do as a government of Canada. If you want to be part of the funded system, you're part of that. Paul talked about the anti-doping agency created in the early 90s. That's probably an example, although the tremendous public support demand for that was part of it too. The Sport Dispute Resolution Centre of Canada, which was created in the early aughts, was only brought to life by a very strong minister saying, this is what we're going to do, and I don't care, this is what we've got to do for the good of Canadian sport. And we keep on hoping that this minister will do that.
Andy, you have a microphone, and could you bring the microphone up to this gentleman at the front here, please?
Andy, is it on? Can you hear me? Andy Brown from the Sports Integrity Initiative. I'm asking a question really for somebody who can't be here, so apologies for that. But a couple of years ago we brought Kristen Worley along to play the game, and she spoke about her case basically holding the sporting authorities to account in the Human Rights Court of Ontario for the harms performed to her. Now, she's asked me to ask, in May this year, she had a meeting with you, Paul, in which you acknowledged the harms performed to her and your role in that. And she wants to ask, is it appropriate for you to be involved with this safe sport movement, given that?
Well, yeah. Yes, we have a long history with Kristen Worley, a cycling athlete, trans participant in sport, and when we first began to look at trans inclusion in sport, we invited her as someone who could bring great insight into how we might help sport become more safe and welcoming for trans individuals. She participated in that process. We took all of the input from all of the experts. Alice Drager, if you know the area, was there. And somewhere along the way, she found that what we were developing was not good enough or didn't address the issues exactly as she wanted, and so there was kind of a parting of the ways. She became very hostile towards us around that. At the same time, she was pursuing her cycling career, and she had to follow the rules of sport to be able to be certified by the Ontario Olympic Cycling, by the Ontario Cycling Association. And quite frankly, as you might be aware, there is an intersection between trans individuals who may need hormone replacement therapy to manage their hormones so that they can live in a healthy way. But that means externally introduced hormones, and there is an opportunity then to secure a medical exemption for the use of those if they are banned substances, and if they turn up in a test, there has to be an explanation as to why they're there. So that was also a developing area where we were trying to identify appropriate expertise to serve on medical exemption committees. Because there weren't that many medical scientists who were working in that space. So no doubt she may have experienced some frustration there, I don't know. But when she asked to meet with me, and it was around the athlete forum in May in Toronto, I said, well, I'd be happy to meet with her. And she expressed that she had been very harmed by the things that had gone on. And I can only say in a very empathetic way, I said, well, nothing I did was intended to harm you, and I apologize if you felt harmed by anything that happened. We have received the human rights decision, and we have done the things in our organization that we were recommended to do, which included trying to source more experts in this area of trans individuals and the kind of health management they need as they transition and things like that. And we have moved very quickly on that front, and we have written to WADA to encourage them to do the same. So I'm very supportive of Kristen. I think she's a pioneer in this area. She has, tried to speak truth to power at every level. But I would say that sometimes her tactics can be her own worst enemy in trying to have civil discussions around issues.
I was going to say that was a Mission Creek question following Mike McNamee, but also it's within the realm of safe sports, so I think that was probably appropriate. Yes.
Hi, Bob Copeland with McLaren Global Sports Solutions. I'd like to thank everybody on the panel for being such tremendous champions for advancing this issue in Canada in particular, Erin, and actually thank you for sharing your personal perspectives, because it's those personal stories that I think really resonate. My question is, have you looked at the experiences of the U.S. Center for Safe Sport, which has arguably experienced some bumps along the road in terms of implementation, and if so, what have you learned about applying this model to Canada?
Well, I can tell you, Bob, that when we were first asked in the summer in June by Sport Canada to develop those elements that we thought had 90% approval at that summit, we understood it was to develop all of those elements from jurisdiction to public disclosure. And so we set about to do that, but we didn't want to do that in isolation. We were informing ourselves from our work in anti-doping, but we reached out to a number of experts, including USA Safe Sport, including Nancy, whose double-barrel last name escapes me right now, but who has been speaking at a number of sessions here, who's very knowledgeable in this area. And we thought there were a lot of good things in USA Safe Sports Code, including some of the definitions around physical and emotional abuse, some of the way in which they were dealing with sanctions. For example, just as a quick aside, the sport community was asking us to develop sanctions that could be identified and be specific for every form of abuse. And we were saying the breadth of abuse is so far and wide, and each case is going to have situations. And so, we're going to have latitude to apply proportionality to the determination of a sanction. But I think also in investigating USA Sport, we heard a couple of things. One, that the governance structure funded by the US Olympic Committee was perhaps not independent and allowing the operation of USA Sport to operate independently, so that might be a flaw. The other thing we heard, though, is that once they opened the doors, they are being overwhelmed by demand for their services. And to the earlier point about it takes athletes maybe 15, 20 years to report long after they've retired, that's in that environment where there's a lack of trust and a belief that anything will happen. When you create an independent organization and athletes start to begin to have trust that good things might happen, there will be no reprisal, something's going to be pursued, then you're going to get a lot of complaints brought forward. And most of the maltreatment is going to happen at the community level, just in terms of numbers, because that's the largest number of participants in sport. So they were being overwhelmed and crushed by the onslaught of complaints, given the resources and capacity they have. So they're going to have to work that out. But that's a big issue. We were aware of that, and in the model we developed, we delegated independent organizations at the provincial level who would then oversee the municipal, and this independent organization would audit and ensure the implementation. And in the same way, you could download the appropriate costs of such a program to the place where the costs were being incurred at the municipality, at the provincial level, at the national level. So I think we learned some good things from it. It was very informative, but there are some weaknesses as well.
As we discovered from the Catholic Church, safe reporting triggers huge numbers of subsequent reports. Yes?
Thanks. My name is Kelsey Erickson, and I'm the Safe Sport Director at USA Cycling and the Anti-Doping League. So I was at Leeds Beckett previously and doing a lot of research around whistleblowing, and one of the things that stands out to me about the structure in Canada is CCS is quite different than what we have in the US as far as you guys look at more than just anti-doping. And so when you're talking about creating an independent body, I mean, that was one of the things that we looked at in anti-doping with whistleblowing was there was a lot of things around they want an independent organization, but at the same time, there is that element of they want somebody that understands sport and understands the nuances and the cultural norms within it. And so oftentimes they would kind of do the, you know, we want an independent body, but they still have to know enough about sport. And so I guess my question to you would be, it seems like you have a really nice setup within the CCES where this could fall under, and I think moving forward we're going to see these things kind of starting to merge together. As you've already said, you looked at your anti-doping structure and used that to begin. I'm just curious as to why you wouldn't think to bring this within the CCES structure.
That is certainly one option.
Yes.
And I think that as a candidate host, I can think of no organization more qualified than the CCES. The struggle, though, is to get the federal government, which has the creation power, to create through legislation or another mechanism a completely independent, pan-Canadian, uniform body that would be completely independent from the sports bodies and completely independent from Sport Canada and the provincial governments. And I mean, maybe it would all be done at the same time, but the first thing we need to get is the minister to say, despite what I've tried to do in the last 18 months, I'm now persuaded that we need a completely independent mechanism. And I'm going to commission a group to tell me how to create that. That's at least that's the advice that I'm giving her.
Yeah.
And one candidate would be to link it with one of the two freestanding bodies now, like the CCS. Another one would be to create a third independent mechanism.
Yeah, and so, I mean, the logic behind what you say, of course, has not escaped us. And so when we say an independent organization that could address this issue, and you say, well, the CCS is an independent organization with a mandate for fair, safe, and open sport, it's already got an infrastructure established. Does it make sense? But I don't promote that because, number one, in the beginning I may have, and sport organizations push back very hard because then they look at it as empire building, or they see it as trying to grab money that is in the sports system that was going to go to us instead of them. That zero-sum game continues to operate in terms of the federal government says they have this much money to fund, and if they're to fund something new, like an independent organization like this, sport organizations immediately say, well, that's going to come out of our pockets, and we're going to lose money. So that's another issue and another reason to push back.
Laura.
Okay, well, I was going to ask this question before you asked yours because I went to the AGM of the Sport Dispute Resolution Center of Canada last month, and they've already got a mechanism. It's definitely flawed. What the SDRCC did is they compiled a list of qualified investigators, and the NSO can come and use one of those investigators. Now, the big problem, of course, is that the NSO comes. But their new model is that the athlete comes. That they have they have a hotline. They're the place with the hotline, and that an athlete can go to them. And I did say, because Andy, you brought up the Ontario Human Rights Commission. I did say to the SDRCC, one other place is the various provincial human rights commissions. Mostly it would be Ontario, because most of our NSOs are located in Ottawa, which is in Ontario. And they did say, yeah, that is a valid place to go. So now the other thing is that when I read how much money the government gave them, it was like $67,900 for both the hotline and to run this thing in English and French all the way through, which is ridiculous. It's not nearly enough. But I was wondering, no one mentioned the SDRCC and what they're doing. And if they did revamp that What, is that an option?
You know, it is can I?
Yeah.
It is a potential body, but what I worry is that they can't firewall the investigations for the disputes they're already doing and the adjudications that we're already doing from the investigation of gender-based violence and maltreatment. And so, although I'm very, you know, I'm a big fan of I had a part in creating the SDRCC, and I think this pilot, because it's only a short-lived pilot, is better than a kick in the teeth. I don't see this as a lasting solution.
And I would add, Laura, that just as a bit of historical context, that before SDRCC existed, the Canadian Anti-Doping, the CCS, administering the Canadian Anti-Doping Program, we investigated the doping cases, we asserted the violation, we proposed the sanction, and then we moved over to another part of our organization and we conducted the hearing. And we said, that's not right.
Yeah.
We need that separation.
That's the problem.
And we created SDRCC. Now SDRC is turning around and saying, we can carry out the investigations, we'll put up a firewall, don't worry about it, we'll conduct the investigation, assert the violation, then we'll come over to our arbitrators and have to do the hearings. That's not right.
So the solution is probably a third unit in the end?
I think so. I think
that would be ideal.
The other thing about SDRCC to remember, SDRCC to remember, all of the board of directors of the SDRCC are appointed by the Minister of Sport. Our board is fully independent. It is a representation not of government, not of sport. These are just experts in Canada who bring their expertise to guide our organization. So we are fully independent now. You could say, where do you get your money? Well, we get it from largely from the government. And so you could say, well, our independence is compromised in that way. But those, you know, iconic Canadians who represent our board of directors will not be, you know, pressured by the government of Canada to do anything. So I think we have a better model in that sense.
I see and feel the fatigue setting in here. We will be here for another 10 minutes or so if anybody wants to come up and talk about it, but let me close this session now, and coffee's waiting probably. Thank you.
Hey, Sherry.
One of the things that caught my attention was, you know, not in sort of those points.
And about arm's length and about removing conflicts of interest. And I think that has been one of the major hurdles that you will hear about today and that we will be talking about today. So let me just tell you that the running order has changed. I'll be establishing a context for this current struggle. This will be followed by Paul Melia from the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, who will be talking about the stages of the current struggle and how it's proceeding. The athlete's voice is very prominent on this panel, and we have both Erin Willson from the University of Toronto and Ashley Labrie from AthletesCAN, who will be speaking for athletes in this process. And Bruce Kidd will be wrapping up this session with the aptly titled "One Step Forward, Two Steps Backwards" as part of the struggle. Can I ask you to put my slides up, please? What I should finally close with this is that every day we delay on establishing some good policy in this area, athletes remain vulnerable and athletes are suffering. So that is a continuing part of this. So, where did this come from? Why is this struggle happening? late 80s, early 90s, there's no reason to think that athletes were not suffering before this time, but it came to public recognition and certainly academic recognition right around this time. I started doing a series of interviews with retired high-performance athletes in 1988, over about 4 years, almost 50 athletes, and several of them, several of the women, spoke to me about sexual abuse that they experienced, and they all told me it was the first time they'd ever told anybody about it. Nobody had asked. My question was, tell me about the good, the bad, and the ugly in your experience as an athlete, and so that shocked me in a sense, and so I began to look at it in much more depth. Celia Brackenridge in the UK, right coincidentally about the same time and completely independently, began also to engage with this issue. Todd Crossett, who's still at the University of Massachusetts, wrote a paper in 1986 about US swim coaches and their athletes and the sexual relationships that were there, and so that was kind of the canary in the coal mine. Laura Robinson wrote an article, as she mentioned, in 1992 in Canada's national newspaper about the abuse of women athletes. Growing media attention, a documentary in 1953 in Canada on our Panorama equivalent program, which Laura also mentioned and was also helped to work on, which brought that to national attention. And then from 1994 to 1996, CAUSE, the Canadian Association for the Advancement of Women in Sport, the national sport organizations who were receiving Sport Canada funding, and Sport Canada worked to develop a policy to prevent harassment and abuse. The policy grew out of this cultural moment where all of a sudden there was media attention about it and athletes beginning to speak up about their experiences. And so the policy required all national sport organizations to have a policy to prevent harassment and abuse in their organization. So, you're talking about 48 different policies, so that was clearly the first kind of mistake, but there was good guidance for them from the Canadian Association for the Advancement of Women in Sport. And the policy also linked the receipt of federal government funding for the NSOs and under the Sport Funding and Accountability Framework to having harassment policies and to having arm's length independent harassment officers. Preferably one man and one woman for each national sport organization. These would be independent officers who would be able to receive complaints and negotiate them without being under the influence of the sport organization. Subsequent events from the establishment of the policy, it was world leading at the time. Celia and I frequently bickered about whether UK or Canada had the first policy, but certainly they came at about the same time. But right away in 1997, after the policy was established, the Graham James sexual abuse of young male hockey players case came to court, and the NHL connection here is that several of the players that he abused went on to become NHL players, and one a star player. And 1997 also, the Maple Leaf Gardens sexual abuse scandal, where young boys were groomed and brought into the locker room and by staff at Maple Leaf Gardens. So Maple Leaf Gardens was where the Toronto Maple Leafs played at that time. And so again, there's an NHL connection. And of course, tellingly, the prominence of these events was that it involved the abuse of boys. Women had been complaining for quite a number of years before this, but they were prominent because it was boys, because there was a professional sport connection, and so they did garner this major media attention at that time. So 2010, 2000 to 2014, you know, the policy's in place and basically nothing happens. And you'll see why nothing happened when I look at the results of our research. So little evidence at all that the policy's intent, that is to prevent harassment and abuse, little evidence that it was working. There was occasional information that you would hear from an NSO that somebody had been suspended after hearings, but there was no transparency to the process, and certainly NSOs were not telling other NSOs that, you know, or even other sports clubs that this person had been suspended for misconduct. But all of this time, from 1996 through to today, every few weeks there will be an article, whether it's in a local newspaper or a more major newspaper, about some coach, usually a coach, who has been who's in court. So criminal involvement takes place when the sport organization, over-behaviour your sport organizations are supposed to be dealing with and preventing. So Gretchen Kerr and I did a study to evaluate the policy to see how it was working, if it was working, had anything changed as a result of the policy. And the results were that there was no evidence that Sport Canada had ever withheld funding from an NSO for failure to have a policy or a harassment officer, even though, as the data you will see shortly showed, a lot of them didn't have a harassment officer, and 6 of the 42 we studied didn't even have a policy that we could find. And this was almost 20 years after the policy was supposed to be in place. No evidence that any of the 42 NSOs had an arm's length harassment officer, and only 5 of the 36 that had a policy also declared that they identified a harassment officer for their organization. None of them were independent or arm's length. They were always a staff member of the NSO. There were mixed evidence of the policies being in place. We were able to find some policies, sometimes with great difficulty, for 36 of 42 organizations we looked at. Of those 36, all of them identified a most defined harassment and abuse in their policy. 70% defined and or gave examples of sexual abuse. Few identified or defined any other forms of abuse, like neglect, physical abuse, psychological abuse in the policy. And only 6 out of the 36 policies that were there actually identified sexual relations between a coach and an of-age athlete as being problematic. The policies are very mixed in terms of the way they outline the roles of harassment officers, the rights of respondents, and the actual complaints procedures. And the policies were often found 3 or 4 steps into the website. You know, they weren't on the homepage, they weren't even notified on the homepage. You really had to dig into the websites to find the policy. And sometimes the policies were fragmented. Part of it would be in the ethics guidelines, a part of it would be in the code of conduct, you know, those kinds of things. So, research to practice, Gretchen Kerr and I started to rework the research into a position paper, and in that position paper, which came out last year, we advocated arm's length investigation and adjudication of complaints. We advocated a duty to report suspected abuse with penalties for failure to report, and we advocated protection for complainants protection from retaliation, because that's the greatest fear of the athletes in the organizations. As I said, the position paper came out in 2018, and it came out at another ideal cultural moment And I'll turn that over to Paul now to pick up on that.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Paul Melia from the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport. We're Canada's national anti-doping organization, but our mandate is much broader than that. Our vision is fair, safe, and open sport for all Canadians, and certainly doping is about fairness and athlete safety, but the maltreatment of athletes is certainly about the safety of athletes, and so in that sense, they have some things in common. They also have a history in common, a history of broken promises, betrayal of trust, and fear of reprisal and intimidation. These exist both for doping and they exist for athletes with respect to safe sport. And they both also contain this catastrophic conflict of interest when a sport organization tries to administer their program to address doping or the safety of athletes from maltreatment. What I want to do today is quickly go over the road we've been on over the last couple of years, picking up on where Peter left off, to talk about the efforts that we have been pursuing in this window of opportunity that has once again occurred to us in our country, the context of which I describe very, very high level on the slide. There are many other things, of course, that have come to create the context, that have created the opportunity for us to move this idea from an aspiration to action. Really importantly on this context, though, was the Minister of Sport back in June of 2018. We had a Minister of Sport who came into the portfolio and for whatever reason chose to make the safety of athletes her issue and the one she wanted to build her legacy as sport minister on. And she was very passionate about it. She believed very strongly in the need to create safe environments for athletes. And so she brought the political will that is so often missing when you're trying to move ideas to action. She brought that political will and forced things forward. So in June of 2018, she announced once again to the sport community, the national sport governing bodies, that going forward, their funding was going to be tied to providing a safe sport environment for their athletes. Now, that was great in concept again, but it lacked any definition as to what that might mean in practice. And so the national sport governing bodies were left in a bit of a vacuum as to know, well, what are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to do it? What's the big plan here? At the same time, the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, who had been looking at this issue along with AthletesCAN and along with academics who have been working in this space, including the three up here with me on the panel, began to look at the design of a comprehensive approach to safe sport, and Peter touched on some of the core elements of that approach. And I would just say that in developing that approach from the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sports perspective, there was a lot to be learned from how we had developed the Canadian Anti-Doping Program. So last May, 2019, we convened a national summit bringing together around 200 sports stakeholders from every level of sport in the country to look at what may be the core components of a comprehensive pan-Canadian safe sport program. I was asked to present, and in my presentation, I paralleled our Canadian anti-doping program and the elements that make it up, and suggested that with adaptation, those same elements could be the design for a comprehensive pan-Canadian safe sport program. And so at that summit, we were able to put that to the test, and we got from the 200 participants over 90% support for the elements I outlined and over 90% support for the principles that I outlined that should be used for the design and implementation of the approach. The athlete voice was critical at this summit. They supported this approach with 100% unanimity from the athletes and spoke very strongly and forcefully about it. The core elements, not surprisingly, are these. You have to have jurisdiction, you have to have violations and sanctions, education, reporting, and so And so we fleshed those out, not in great detail, but just what the core components of these elements would entail if we were addressing safe sport. And we also laid out the guiding principles that received over 90% support. How should we go about designing it, and how should it be implemented? And key to implementation was an independent organization to do that. And here are the other principles that we suggested for the design and implementation. So we were then asked by the government of Canada, Sport Canada, to begin to design and draft an outline for that program. And we set about to do that in early June, and we developed all of those elements that you saw on the slide previously, which were the elements. And we brought that forward, and they said, no, that's not what we wanted. We only want you to define the prohibited conduct and the proposed sanctions. And so we went back and we extracted those and we developed those. And we developed them with expert input, and we took them out over the summer to national sport organizations for consultation, and we've gotten to version 4 right now, and version 4 has been reviewed by external experts to sport, and we're assimilating their feedback, and we'll submit that on October 21st to Sport Canada for consideration. The plan from there is that code, as they like to call it, I don't believe it's a code, it's not a standalone code, but it does define the prohibited conduct and the proposed sanctions. They would then take that to their provincial colleagues, provincial ministers of sport, and try to get support there. And they've promised us that this fall there will be consultation around implementation of such a code. So that's where we are today, and I just want to highlight a couple of the challenges and issues that have surfaced in this process and this journey that we're on. I mentioned that the minister had set out funding conditions associated with this, but in the wake of that, a fragmented approach was thrown out within the sport community that had no coherence to it at all. So that was a big issue and still remains a big issue, and that's why we have been promoting this comprehensive approach. Scope of abuse, we have moved from just sexual abuse to sexual abuse, physical abuse, and psychological abuse. I think that's a major step forward. The big problem now is that the sport organizations are coming back asking for all kinds of exclusions around physical and emotional abuse. I'm telling them abuse is abuse is abuse, and they're saying, no, in sport, culture of sport, certain things should be tolerated. So that's going to be a big battle, I think, going forward. We hear that unfolding a pan-Canadian safe sport program is fraught with difficulties jurisdictionally between the federal government, the provincial governments, municipal governments. That's another. Everyone's afraid of the cost and who's going to bear it of unfolding a program and implementing it at the community level. Probably the biggest issue, though, is independence versus self-regulation. Major sports do not want to let go of this issue. They want to self-regulate. They want to take the very prohibited conduct and sanctions now and put it into their rules and administer them themselves. And if that's what happens with what we've done so far, this would be a huge tragedy for our effort. And I think the ability to bring the athlete voice to that, as we've done a great job in doing that, but the sport organizations and the government are not listening to the athletes. So I'll stop there. I want to turn it over to the athlete voice to pick it up from here. Thank you.
Let me just say that Ashley and Erin will be co-presenting, so they're going to stay in place there. But what you've heard now up to this point is the struggle. And the struggle, as it usually is in social change and policy change and cultural change, is between forces that prefer the status quo or actually benefit from the status quo, and those who do not benefit from it in any way, who would prefer it to change. And so you can see the scenario set up, and it's now time for the athlete's voice.
Thank you, Peter. Sorry. Okay. I'm Erin Willson. I am an Olympian in the sport of artistic swimming, and I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Toronto. My focus is on abuse in sport. In this presentation, we're going to be discussing, Ashley and I will be discussing our journey over the past really year and a half of addressing safe sport in Canada, both from a research perspective and how we use research to try to inform changes or at least propose solutions for change. To give you some background, I was on Team Canada for about 7 years. There was many highlights to my career, but during that time I also did experience and witness a variety of forms of abuse. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail due to time, but to give you a concept, 6 months before the Olympic Games, my sports psychologist resigned from our team, and his parting words were, "I'm a psychologist, not a psychiatrist, and I don't know how to deal with your coach anymore." After my retirement, I did focus my attention more on a research perspective. I definitely was a hungry and passionate master's student, really trying to advocate for a desire for change. I was sick of the fact that this was continuing to happen and nothing was really being done about it, and more than that, no one was even really talking about it at this point. So with my supervisor, Dr. Gretchen Kerr, and one of our colleagues, Ashley Sterling, we started thinking about all of the ideas of ways we could implement change. Every idea, however, came back to this concept that we need to understand what's happening before we can understand what changes need to be done and how to implement them. This isn't something that was new to them. This was something that they thought of several times before. But the challenge was sport organizations don't really like researchers poking around and asking questions about their athletes and their experiences. So we needed to figure out a way to go directly to the athletes to be able to ask their experiences, which can be often quite difficult in a research perspective. So this is when I remembered my experiences as an athlete and had heard about AthletesCAN, a really awesome organization that Ashley will introduce very shortly, and tried to connect with her and work on this mission together.
Thanks, Erin. I did want to talk a bit about my sport experience as well, because I do believe that the stories are really what connect these two pieces. So I did come from the sport of figure skating. Inherently, the culture increases the vulnerability of young athletes. The first time somebody talked about weight with me, I was 8 years old. I started physio for an injury when I was 10, followed by chiropractic shortly after. I began a dangerous pattern of disordered eating when I was 13. That lasted for about 5 years, at which I was about 84 pounds, wreaked havoc on my body, both physically and mentally. I was taking 6 to 8 ibuprofen at a time to manage pain and whatever else I could get my hands on at the time. I, at 19 years old, couldn't put on my own socks because of the pain that I was in, which shortly followed by L5-S1 laminectomy and discectomy back surgery, which ended my career essentially. That's a very common surgery in our sport, and the point of me telling you this is that I wasn't abused or harassed, but the experiences of athlete around maltreatment and just the cultural impact on their experiences as people is very important. And my story, my experience was not the exception. In fact, through my conversations with athletes over the years, I've known that this has become an epidemic in not just the sports like figure skating or artistic swimming or gymnastics. It's rampant in all sports. So that, it was really personal to me, important to me to be able to share those perspectives with athletes and for athletes. So AthletesCAN, I think all of you are pretty familiar with the organization at this point. We're an athlete association representing Olympic, Paralympic, Commonwealth, Pan, Parapan, American Games, and Senior World Championship athletes in Canada. And over the last year, safe sport has quickly moved to be our top priority. I personally wasn't spending a lot of time on it before the minister's announcement, and that quickly moved to about 70% of my time was being spent on safe sport. And safe sport really intersects with everything else that we do. Athlete well-being, athlete-centered sport, developing leaders to be able to speak out on certain issues that are important to them. So obviously at AthletesCAN, we're athlete-driven, and it was really important to capture a team that was passionate about safe sport to really drive the athlete perspective on this. So these are the athlete leaders in our safe sport working group. Our chair, Allison Forsyth, was a sexual abuse survivor at the hands of her alpine ski coach. Neville Wright, recently retired bobsleigh athlete, was working hard to bring racial discrimination to the forefront of the conversation. Lanny Marshall, Olympic marathon and 10,000 meter athlete, currently is in a major comeback from a really serious injury, very common to her sport. Tony Welby from the Canadian Paralympic Committee, a recently retired judo Paralympian, brought the Paralympic perspective. He's a visually impaired athlete. Liam Smedley, who's a board member of AthletesCAN. Erica Weep, who's an Olympic champion in wrestling and a strong safe sport advocate for her teammates. And Roz Groenwood, who's an Olympic halfpipe skier and a member of the Canadian Olympic Committee Athletes Commission. And of course, Erin.
From a research perspective, we also had a team of researchers on our end, myself, Erin Willson, as well as Dr. Gretchen Kerr and Dr. Ashley Sterling, both out of the University of Toronto, who've been in this space in the research perspective for, as Peter Donnelly said, the past 15 to 20 years. One thing that I did want to mention before we get too far into the study was the working group that Ashley just spoke about was a very essential and crucial part to this. This survey that we produced had about 5 million versions, and a lot of that was because of the really care that all of these athletes had and the input that they had at each step of the way. They would look at the survey and make sure that it was the most relevant as it could be to capture the athlete experience in Canada. So, to begin the survey, the really main purpose of it was to get an understanding of the current landscape of sport in Canada. So we wanted to understand the various types of maltreatment, so not just sexual harm, which is the one that most people focus on, but also emotional harm, neglect, and physical harm. We also wanted to know who the perpetrators of harm were. We did take a look at injury and concussion rates as well as the health outcomes that occurred after experiencing harm. And then finally, did athletes disclose or report their experiences of abuse, and why or why not?
So we knew from the beginning that in order for this to be successful, it had to be driven by the athletes. So we needed our champions, our Safe Sport Working Group, to really rally around this cause and be able to convey the importance of their fellow athletes and teammates in filling out this survey. One of the messages that they brought was that, I may have been abused, and we can't change that, but we can change the future of sport for Canada and the next generation. And that was a really key point in the campaign. We also had a really extensive digital campaign to continue the momentum through the 4 weeks that the survey was open. So we have the video here to show you.
Our association, AthletesCAN, representing the athlete voice in our sports system, is partnering with the University of Toronto to conduct a baseline prevalence study to measure our experience as high-performance athletes with the issues of sexual abuse, harassment, discrimination, and other forms of maltreatment. As a victim of abuse and harassment myself, I cannot begin to tell you how important this work is. So please fill out this anonymous survey. It will do so much.
Will it be uncomfortable? Probably, but it'll be worth it. Your answers will inform the very recommendations that could change the landscape of sport in Canada for the better, so that future athletes do not have to face the same challenges.
To help ensure that future athletes do not feel ashamed or silenced, and to help better protect the vulnerable, to make sure that those negative behaviors and practices that are unacceptable are no longer accepted in our sport culture.
Whether you've experienced abuse firsthand or not, we need to hear from you. Whether you're a Paralympian, an Olympian, a current or retired national team athlete, we need to hear from you.
Sport should be a positive experience. It's time to speak up. It's time for the athlete voice to be heard. It's time for your voice to be heard, and for athletes to be part of the solution.
So over the course of the month that the survey was out, we were able to gather 1,001 responses from Canadian national team athletes. This included 794 current athletes and 237 retired athletes. The retired athletes had been retired within the past 10 years to make sure we were ensuring relevancy to the survey. Our split for males to females was about 40 to 60%. Our average age was 27 And then 10% of our athletes had a disability or identified as having a disability. 10% were identified as racialized, and then a little bit lower numbers for the other types of diversity. We found that 75% of athletes had experienced at least one form of harm during their national team. When we broke it down into types of harm, psychological harm was the most prominent. About 60% of athletes had experienced at least one form of emotional harm or psychological harm. This was closely followed by neglect, sexual harm, and then physical harm. This chart demonstrates some of the behaviors that we asked specifically about and the frequency that they were experienced. So for sexual harm, sexist jokes and remarks were the most commonly experienced, followed by intrusive sexual glances and explicit communication. For psychological harm, the most frequently experienced behavior was being shouted at in an angry or critical manner. And also to note, psychological harm, it wasn't just about one-time experiences, but a pattern of behaviors is what we asked about. So the second for psychological harm was being gossiped or told lies about, being put down, embarrassed, or humiliated, and being intentionally ignored. For physical harm, overwhelmingly, the most frequent type was being punished with excessive exercise. So running sprints for being late and those kind of behaviors. And then for neglect, it was being forced to train while exhausted or injured, and being encouraged to sacrifice other aspects of your life, including your career or your education. When we asked by whom, I guess not super surprisingly, coaches were first across the board. However, this was closely followed by peers, which really indicates that the culture of sport isn't just from people in positions of authority, but anyone can be harmful towards others. Other people to note were high-performance directors, trainers, and sport administrators. When we looked at the health outcomes, we found that every type of abuse had significant outcomes with all of the behaviors that are on the right hand of the screen, or the left hand of the screen. So thoughts with engaging in eating disorder behaviors, engaging in disordered eating behaviors, thoughts of self-harm, engaging in self-harm, and having suicidal thoughts. When we broke down these numbers a little bit more, we found that 19% of athletes engaged in disordered eating behaviors, 6% of athletes engaged in self-harming behaviors, and 16% of athletes had suicidal thoughts. We also ended the survey with 2 open-ended questions, one of which was, do you have any additional comments? And the other was, do you have any other recommendations to advance safe sport? This was one of the most surprising things, where we had 800 comments that we had to sift through during the survey. The 2 main things that were spoken about were the normalization of an abusive culture. And the willful blindness that comes with the concept of because you're winning or because you're being successful, then that's okay. The second was the overwhelming feeling of being silenced. So not feeling like you had a safe space to go to report or discuss your instances of harm because of the potential implications. From there, we came up with 5 different recommendations that the athletes, from all of the athletes' comments. The first was an overwhelming need for an independent third party to disclose, report, and to support through the investigation process. Some more stats for you. Only 15% of athletes in the study ever reported their experiences with harm, and 60% of athletes reported that they were worried about the repercussions if they were to report. That's really summarized by the quote from this athlete. The second recommendation is an increase for education, and this is for all stakeholders, for coaches, for staff, but also for athletes. Even when we presented this survey results to a set of athletes, a lot of them didn't understand that these behaviors were actually considered harmful because it hadn't so accepted within their culture and seen so frequently. The third recommendation is accountability. making sure that there are consequences to people perpetrating these behaviors of harm. Because that's something that's not really been seen. There's often instances and examples of these trying to be covered up. They don't really want, organizations don't really want their name associated to it. So we'll bury the information instead of really trying to deal with it appropriately. The fourth recommendation was prohibiting sexual relationships between coaches and athletes. And a lot of this is because the power differential that is between a coach and an athlete. There is an argument that if someone is in a position of power, the person who does not have the power can never actually consent to that behavior. And finally, there was a request to take a long, hard look at our culture of sport. They've identified that it is very broken, and this is because of a variety of reasons. Our funding structure in Canada is set up to reward medals and to fund athletes who get medals. This also leads to a winning at all cost mentality, where you can sacrifice your physical and mental well-being in pursuit of this of these medals, basically. There's also an overwhelming sense that athletes are seen as commodities. They can be replaced in a second, and there's 10 other athletes that can take their place. So from this, we really advocate for a person-first approach. So focusing on athlete well-being and the holistic development of athletes, not just their performance success.
Thanks, Erin. So what are we doing now to drive the change forward? And I'm going to talk a little bit about the role that we've played over the last 18 months or so. So we initially, when the minister came out and made her announcement, we spoke at the announcement and just reaffirmed the importance of this and the importance of the athlete voice in the process. Subsequently, we were invited to pretty much every working group in the system that was to address different avenues of what safe sport will look like in the future. Some of them were a bit, we were there as the token athlete voice. Some of them, really did enable us to speak our mind. But those continued without much productivity, I guess you could say, or output for a number of months, which was quite frustrating, having the same discussions over and over again. We did the study, and immediately after that, we felt we needed to do a Safe Sport Summit where we brought together over 50 athletes from 35 sports. We pulled all of this together in 1 month with zero funding from the government. And we spent 2 days educating athletes around the issues of safe sport, and then an entire day talking about what do we need to do to create a safe sport environment for you. And the consensus statements that came out of that summit, which, by the way, the 50 athletes had over 400 years of national team experience under their belt, so it was a very well-experienced group that had a lot of input. The consensus statements that came out of that were really validating the recommendations that came out of the study. And we took those recommendations to the National Summit in Ottawa, where all of the sport leaders from the national sport organizations and the multi-sport organizations, provincial and territorial sport organizations as well, were gathering to address safe sport. And our presentation was coined as the TSN turning point of the conference. A lot of administrators really got behind what the athletes were saying and agreed that we need an independent body to address this. And in the end, the consensus statements and recommendations that came out of that summit actually mirrored the recommendations that we were making as athletes. Unfortunately, after that event, the discussion went back to the barriers of provincial territorial jurisdiction, the costs of an independent body, the time it would take to do that. Let's focus on the initiatives that we're doing in the system and the existing mechanisms as opposed to looking at the independent body right now. We need to do this at a really slow pace so that our provincial and territorial governments can grasp the concept of what safe sport looks like and a universal code of conduct. So we went along and we started the Universal Code of Conduct, working with CCES on an expert athlete panel to kind of drive athlete voice within that document. And then when the independent body part of that was removed a little bit from the process, again, it was frustrating for us that this wasn't going to be addressed anytime soon. Our federal election's coming up next week, and moving forward, AthletesCAN is, about a month ago we had our annual general meeting, and our athletes said, safe sport is the #1 priority. It's the only priority for us to move forward with at this point. We want to have an independent body. We're tired of waiting for the government and the sport system to make those changes. We're going to drive the change, and we're going to do it through grassroots advocacy, through lobbying. So we're about to embark on that. As soon as this election is over, we're going to ensure that safe sport and an independent body for the oversight of safe sport in Canada is on the new minister's mandate letter. It's a priority, and that it's going to happen within the next year. We hope at least discussions around actually implementing such a body. And we believe that that's the most important piece for meaningful change in the system, and we won't stop mobilizing athletes until that happens.
Thank you, colleagues. Whoops, go back. My name is Bruce Kidd, and I'm also from the University of Toronto. My task this afternoon is to pull the threads of our presentations together and put them in the context of making change in the Canadian sports system. I do so as an insider-outsider. I was the co-chair of 2 of the government advisory bodies that met during the last 2 years on these issues. In particular, the federal, provincial, territorial work group that examined this issue with an extensive consultation for almost 2 years. And also, most recently, as a member of the Minister's Special Advisory Committee on Gender Equity in Sport. Very briefly, when we talk about the Canadian sports system, as we do in Canada in shorthand, we refer to a network of state-directed, financed, monitored, and rewarded agencies, national sports organizations, and multi-sport organizations, primarily in the Olympic sports. It's led by Sport Canada, which is a line federal agency, not an arm's-length body as exists in most other liberal democratic countries, under legislative authority from the Physical Activity in Sport Act. And the national structure is cloned at the provincial and territorial level, and it's been in place for 50, 60 years. Sadly, we've experienced recurring policy cycles in this and other issues. When there's a crisis and public concern, there's always government consultation, and then a policy response, and then sports sector resistance, and then a failure of the federal or provincial government to monitor and insist upon compliance. And we live that cycle again. Peter Donnelly described the cycle around gender-based violence, but that cycle has been repeated again and again and again. One of the sad lessons I've learned from my long experience as a policy advisor is getting the policy right is not enough. If you don't get the implementation, monitoring, and compliance right, then the policy is simply going to make the government look good and nothing will happen. So I've entitled this presentation Baby Step Forward, 2 Steps Back, because where we are today, that summarizes what has happened over the last 2 years. To be sure, the government has stepped into this crisis, and the minister passionately has made this a priority for her government. But she's chosen to renew and strengthen the existing policy, which Peter and Gretchen have shown has been inadequate. To be sure, most sports bodies have accepted responsibility for doing a much better job, and I think that's a much more positive climate. And Sport Canada has agreed to monitor compliance, something that traditionally they've not been good on, establish a hotline, and establish an independent service available to the sports bodies for independent investigation. They've also, as you've heard from our panel, initiated the creation of a universal code of conduct. Yet overall, our conclusion from this, or let's put it this way because we're still hopeful of making change, the current position is that it's really backward to where we were in 1996. Because the NSOs, the National Sports Organizations, still define misconduct and abuse in the system that's being created. And as Paul and Erin and Ashley mentioned, they insist upon sport-by-sport exemptions